Welcome to the best move problem solving exercise number 71. Yet again, we have a problem with white to move and we're asked if white is equal, better, or worse. So we have all three options available in this position. And in this position, we are given only three moves to consider for white. So there may be other moves and we're just not asked to consider those. Hopefully we were given the three best moves to consider, or the three most reasonable candidate moves. Our moves are knight c3, knight captures e5, and rook a to d1. So those are our choices. We're not asked to evaluate anything else. I will say first of all that my favorite of those candidate moves, just on instinct alone, is that I love rook to d1. So let's start, whoops, got those arrows going. Let's start with rook a d1. I love this move because I love having rooks on the d and e file, assuming that's where the rooks want to be in a position. I just love having centralized rooks, and I find that players over and over again forget to put the rooks on the central files, and the rook stays on a1 the entire game, and so I really, really want to bring this rook over to d1, which makes complete sense to me. After rook to d1, I'm wondering if there's some sort of tactical refutation of this move. Frankly, although I'm trying to think of this just as a game position, I don't really know anything going in. I kind of feel like the question is preloading me, so I feel like the question suggests in its framing that maybe there's some tricks we have to watch out for. So after rook ad1, I'm looking for some threats for black. Thinking about moves like pawn to c6. It seems unlikely to me that black could try and chase the knight away on d5 and then go get a2 without repercussions. But maybe black could play c6 and force the knight away and then go get a2. It's possible. A lot of times bishops get trapped on a2, but I think if I played pawn to b3, there'd be the move c4. So it may be the case that black could go get a2. Rook to d1, c6, knight b6 check. I don't know what I'm thinking about. This is silly because if black ever plays c6, then I will always have knight c3. So that's going to always keep a2 safe. I can just always retreat knight c3. And c6 is not desirable in general principles for black because black is loosening squares like b6. And just generally softening his dark squares, I think. d6 is also starting to look a little vulnerable. Black doesn't want to play c6 unless there's a really good tactical reason for c6 in the position. So rook to d1, I'm throwing c6 out the window. There's moves like knight take f3. There's also this bishop that's loose on f4, which is temporarily defended by the knight on d5. But black can play bishop takes d5, and then he has options like knight d3 check and knight f3 check. This is starting to feel like the problem. I'm concerned about the looseness of this bishop on f4. So let's see, rook to d1, and let's say immediately bishop takes d5 for black. E takes d5 or rook takes d5. I don't know why. I don't really like e takes d5 for white. I think one reason I don't really like e takes d5 is just that I just put a rook on the d file, but that doesn't seem like an extremely valid reason. All right, let's not get worried about which way I take back for the moment, and let's just say I take back. Pick rook takes d5. Might not make much of a difference. And then black would have knight to d3 check, or knight takes f3, or knight to g4 check. And I'm starting to think that knight takes f3 looks pretty good. After knight takes f3, we're threatening the bishop on f4 and the rook on e1. White can play king takes f3, keeping everything defended for the moment. But then I think black would be at least a bit better with bishop takes f4. I think you cannot play king takes f4. We're getting too many arrows here. But if you can visualize that far, after bishop takes f4, king takes f4, if the rook is on d5, there is rook takes d5, and we suddenly find that there's a pin on the rook on e1. White could throw in rook takes d8 first, so that the rook isn't hanging on d5, but I think then that this rook can take, after the king takes, black has rook to d2, forking two pawns, and I think black has every chance to win that rook endgame. So we found one bad line for white, which does not necessarily throw the whole continuation out of the window, but this is concerning. Let's think for a moment about the possibility of pawn takes d5 instead of rook takes d5. That seems like the only real variation to me on this line. So we've got rook to d1, bishop takes d5, pawn takes d5. I need to think a little bit here. I'm not sure. I guess knight take f3, king take f3, rook takes e1, or bishop takes f4, king takes f4, rook takes e1, rook takes e1, rook takes d5 also pockets a pawn and looks good for black. So it feels to me like everything is just a little bit too loose. After rook d1, it just seems to me like there's just too much hanging on f4 and on d5, and also these pawns end up vulnerable in some lines. And I think that tactically, white has problems. He's at least at a significant disadvantage, I think. So I don't think we are in a position to play rook to d1. So we have knight c3, and we have knight takes e5. So I'm hoping one of these lines is better. After knight takes e5 for white, let's see. I'm assuming, rightly or wrongly, that black would recapture. The other alternative being that he could play bishop takes d5 as an intermezzo. This is hanging out in the air for a lot of these lines. After knight takes e5, assuming that black captures back straight away, he's going to have to capture back, I think, with the bishop. Because if black captures back with the f-pawn, then he's left with an isolated e5 pawn and a very, very, very bad bishop on d6. So I would think that that continuation would be enormously favorable for white, maybe even positionally winning. So after knight takes e5, bishop takes e5. What options are there for white and black? Knight takes e5, bishop takes e5. Nothing tactical really going on. I think we could play bishop takes e5 for white. Probably makes sense to do bishop takes e5 because black has the two bishops. So we'd rather have a knight versus one bishop rather than a bishop and knight versus two bishops. And after that, black would again play rook takes e5. And I would think that this is a little favorable for black. Maybe more than a little favorable. I like this, I think, a fair bit. We're running into the problem that the f-pawn and the knight are a little bit loose. There's other problems as well, like black's rook is the one that's getting open. All of this looks better for black to me. So knight takes e5, bishop takes e5, bishop takes, rook takes. Looks pretty good. I would not think that black would ever benefit from throwing in bishop takes d5 in the middle of these lines, because then white is going to gain another piece to attack e5, and the end result would be that at some point, like when the rook recaptures on e5, white would be able to play rook 1 takes e5, and he'll be able to force the f-pawn to capture. After which black is left with that isolated e-pawn that we talked about, and is certainly not doing as well as he is in these other lines we're looking at. So I'm not crazy about knight takes e5, and maybe there might be some defenses in there, but I'm not crazy about it. I think my question is, what about knight c3? At this moment, I'm really inclined to play knight c3, just kind of hold the position, and then play rook to d1 and go from there. That said, playing a retreating move is illogical. It only makes sense if the real crux of the problem from white's perspective is that his knight on d5 is unstable from the logical standpoint. It may just be the best retreating move available to kind of hold the position, but it's just questionable in my mind to retreat in a position where already there's problematic variations. My first thought is that black could play knight c4, and after knight c3, knight c4, black is hitting the bishop on f4, not great, and he's also hitting this pawn on b2. I'm thinking that after knight c3, knight c4, we're looking at a very possible bishop takes d6, and then we have to ask ourselves if black wants to play rook takes d6, or if he wants to play knight c4 comes back to d6. I think that he wants to play rook takes on d6. And maybe things are fine for white. He can play b3, pushing the knight back. And after he pushes the knight back, I don't think there's anywhere great for the knight to go. White can cover everything with like a rook to d1. There's also the option for black after knight c3 of moves like knight d3 check, pawn takes, bishop takes f4. And there's also knight g4 check, pawn takes knight, bishop takes f4. I think that after knight c3, knight d3 check, pawn takes, bishop takes f4, black is much, much better on the basis of the two bishops. Like, very difficult to play the position for white in the long term. He's got this pawn on d3 that's very weak, and black can liquidate the pawn structure in ways that are favorable to him with moves like c4, which will open up his bishops. So I'm thinking in this position that knight c3 is really bad after knight d3 check, just positionally really bad. So I have at this point ruled out all of the continuations. I don't like any of them. None of them are appealing, so I have to find the best of a bad situation. My first thought is I'm wondering if knight takes e5 was more tenable than I thought earlier. And maybe there's a quality in this line. Knight takes e5, then we had bishop takes e5. After knight takes e5, bishop takes e5. I think bishop takes and rook takes. And I think now is when we do knight c3. And we're looking to play a rook to the d file to contest it. We have e4 and everything else defended at the moment. I don't think white is better. Some might think that white is better because white has the might think white is better because white has the better pawn structure. Black has doubled pawns. I don't think that that's true. The e pawn is backwards and black has a bishop versus a knight, but I think that after knight takes e5, bishop takes e5, bishop takes e5, rook takes e5, knight c3, we hold on, and I think white is equal, not better. And honestly, I think I might slightly prefer black's practical chances, but I think white's about equal after knight to c3. I think after knight takes e5, leading to knight c3, and after the immediate knight c3 and the immediate rook d1, I think white has problems. So I think we've got to try and simplify with knight takes e5 here. That's a long and difficult problem. I think white has a slightly difficult position, and I think he can basically equalize with knight takes e5. And these kind of situations are the ones that come up in games all the time. And honestly, they're much harder than mates in 10 most of the time. There's so many small details to weigh. And that's really when you see grandmasters outplaying masters, masters outplaying A players, and A players outplaying, C players, etc., etc. So in this position, I think knight takes e5, and I think it's a play to equalize the position. This is probably one of the trickiest problems we've seen yet, and there's a discrepancy between what the grandmaster and what the computer thinks we should play. I was thinking that we could equalize after knight takes e5, and I'm definitely wrong about that. My analysis of knight c3 is right on point there, and it's not good. And Grandmaster Portish, this is a game of Portish's, he recommended the move rook to d1. So we can see here the computer analysis indicates that knight take e5 is the best play, and rook to d1 is down the line from exchanging on e5, and b3 is actually the computer recommendation. So b3, which we weren't asked to consider, may be better. Of course, all the analysis in the book is pre-computers, which is always really, really challenging. So let's look at all three continuations. After the immediate knight c3, knight d3 check, which we discussed, pawn takes, bishop takes f4, is just really, really good for black. The computer points to some advantage for black, negative 0.6. I think that black's practical advantage is probably much higher because black has such long-term potential. I would think this is one of those positions where in human games you might have a shot, but with perfect play, sort of God playing God, I think the two bishops and the better rooks and the ability to break out the position with c4, which happened a few moves later in the game because this is the continuation chosen in the game, I think these are probably an objectively winning advantage with perfect play, which we never have. So that's knight c3 in the position. If we back up, let's look at knight takes e5, which we were discussing and was what I selected. And the computer agrees with me, although I might be wrong. So that matters a little bit, though. I appreciate that. It's nice to have the computer on your side. So we have knight takes e5, bishop takes e5, bishop takes e5, rook takes e5, which we discussed, and knight c3. Saw all of this, and I thought that white had good chances to equalize, which is probably just really, really silly of me, really naive. Probably the best move, the one that is suggested by Grandmaster Hort in the book, is b5. It makes a lot of sense to me. There is, of course, the threat of playing b4 and pushing the knight back, and there's rook d2 check. The bishop can come around to c6. There's eternal pressure on the pawn on e4. You can double rooks on the e file. You can play the bishop around to c6. That pawn on e4 is such a pain. It's bad for white. It's not lost. It's not lost. It's bad. And it's bad for forever, basically. White's not going to have a chance to improve the structure. He's just going to have to sit and try to hold all the weaknesses. So, all that said, the recommendation of Grandmaster Portish, who won this game, this was a Portish game I said, he was the one who played black and he won the game, was white should have played rook to d1, which is the move that I really, really liked instinctively, and I rejected it on the basis of swapping down. So we have knight takes f3, king takes f3, bishop takes d5, pawn takes d5 is best, and we can either do bishop takes f4 first, or rook takes e1. Rook takes e1 is more forcing, so we'll throw that in. Rook takes e1, bishop takes f4, king takes f4, and then rook takes d5. And interestingly, the computer says that this continuation is about the same as is knight c3 and knight takes e5. Knight takes c3 being the computer worst, and I think objectively worst, but not by that much. And this recommendation from the Grandmaster perspective is the best chance to get a draw, better than the situation after b5. And I think that that's right. Not that my opinion matters much compared to Grandmaster Portish's, but we're in a rook endgame here, and I kind of saw these ideas in the position. It's really, really hard when you're looking at these in analysis to say, I'm going to voluntarily take on such a bad position when the alternatives aren't lost. You're giving up a pawn when you still have other continuations that aren't immediately losing. It's really hard to choose the variation that gives up the pawn. But white does have an active king, an active rook. The rook can come to the 7th rank and harass the pawns, and that offers a lot of drawing chances. White is not out of the woods, but white probably has much, much better practical chances trying to hold a pawn down rook endgame where the only thing he's down is one doubled pawn, rather than hold the other positions where he's permanently in a positionally inferior and significantly inferior position. So this is the best available continuation for white, and a really high-level option, I think. White's got good drawing chances in this position. Probably the position is actually objectively drawn, as opposed to the other positions where I think it might even be objectively lost. But of course, all of this is very difficult. I think this is the most difficult problem in the book thus far.